my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator. Natalie Moore is WBEZ's Southside reporter, where she covers such issues as race, housing, economic development, food injustice, and violence. Moore's work has been broadcast on BBC and NPR's Marketplace, Morning Edition, and Weekend Edition. She is author of The Southside, A Portrait of Chicago and American Segregation, winner of the 2016 Chicago Review of Books Award for Nonfiction. And I invite her and our other speakers to join me on the stage.
We were wondering if we were going to be competing with the State of the Union address. I mean, we are talking about race, right?
Yeah, bravo to all of you.
So we appreciate you being here and not in front of your TV or on your Twitter feed watching. So the guests we have here don't need much of an introduction. You can read their bios. Joy Bivens of the Chicago History Museum and Lisa Lee, UIC, National Public Housing Museum. And the way we structured this conversation is like we're friends. We're letting you in on our conversations that we would probably be having anyway. And then we're going to turn it over to questions and conversation with the audience. But I first want to find out from the two of you, what were your impressions of the race exhibit?
I'll let you go first, Lisa, if you want to.
Okay, sure. Well, I've been hearing about the race exhibit for a long time, and I think in the museum community, which is sort of how I see myself, like I'm a cultural activist, but I also am committed to museums for being spaces of sort of radical resistance and convenings of sort of civic engagement and dialogue. We've been like really hungry for this exhibit to come to Chicago, and also really curious about how do you address an issue which sometimes is inflected either as only a cultural or a sort of biological or a sort of social issue. And so the sort of intermingling of these things is always really interesting. I think ultimately the success of an exhibit is always that sort of reciprocity of the kind of passion, anger, and action that it brings about in the visitor. And so for me, sometimes you always talk about in the exhibit world, what does the exhibit make you think? What does it make you feel? And then what does it make you do, right? And that's the sort of success of an exhibit. So I sort of feel like as you're going through, for me, there's definitely the sense of like new histories that I didn't know, facts, people, and seeing the images. So it's definitely filled with that. And there's a lot of emotional content also in there. But I think the mirror for the museum visitor is like, okay, now that you know this and are feeling this, what are you going to do about it?
So for me, I've seen, obviously, I'm sorry you all have a cold, so you have to excuse me this evening. The race exhibition, I've seen it several times. Obviously, I've worked with it here at the History Museum. But one of the impressions that I was left with is the significance of science in the way we think about race and racial classifications. And as a person who practices history, often I feel some distance, some dissonance with science. But thinking through that as a discipline that has its own history and that it has its own history to contend with, and in terms of the partnership that created this exhibition, the American Anthropological Association and the Science Museum of Minnesota, really thinking about this exhibition and the content that's presented within it as a way of that discipline as coming to terms with the role that it played in kind of solidifying or legitimizing some of the historic ways that we think about race and racial classifications. So one of the things that I'm always struck by when I'm in the gallery is how important the science aspect is of the project. Obviously the history, we have more experience with kind of unpacking that. But what are the interdisciplinary aspects of our world that create the structures that we live with, the systems that we live with. And so I think for me, that's the critical part of the exhibition.
Can I say one more thing about that? And we're really in this weird moment, I feel like. I mean, I was brought up as a feminist scholar, and so much of my life it was about unseating the idea that there's sort of one objective reality, one truth, and science was often the enemy, right? It was sort of like thinking about subjective truths. And we're in a moment now where, you know, there's sort of the people in power, the sort of the systems that be, are like sort of saying that there is no such thing as truth, there aren't actually facts. And so I'm finding myself, you know, being reoriented and thinking how much I want to sort of demand a sort of, you know, affinity to actual sort of what is the truth about this, you know, and sort of and how is science really actually a friend of radical progressive activism, and, you know, it can and should be. Yeah.
Why did the History Museum bring this exhibit to Chicago?
Well, I think part of our mission is to share the stories, or our mission is really to share the stories of Chicago. And anybody who's lived here for any time, a day, a two, understands that racism, racial structures, racial systems are part and parcel of what we deal with as Chicagoans. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to kind of navigate this huge, massive city that we have, the grid, and watch as things change as you move from this side of the city to that side of the city, that side of the track to the other side of the track. And one of the things that is really useful in understanding where you live is to understand the context. And so this exhibition really kind of lays some foundation for understanding the context and the constructs that we live with daily here in Chicago. And also, I think that all of us want to have well, not all of us, but many of us want to have conversations, significant conversations about race and the way it impacts our lives. And often those conversations are really difficult to enter into. And so exhibition programs like this really provide a unique platform for people to start to have those conversations in ways that are on, I wouldn't say neutral, but are not necessarily on hyper-personalized turf. And so bringing this exhibition here really helps us to kind of deal with some of the content that we always deal with here at the History Museum. And from an institutional standpoint, it's really helped us to kind of think through, you know, what are some of the issues that we need to think through as a museum, some of the things that we need to deal with as a museum, because as you can imagine, you can't necessarily bring an exhibition like this to your institution if you're not willing to do some work, or at least to start work, or to restart work that you've started in the past. And so for us, it's been both in work and out work, in the sense that we get to provide platform for our audiences, but also we get to have some conversations here at the museum for ourselves.
Lisa, you said that after people see the exhibit, you want them to think, okay, so I saw it, what do I do? How do I feel? What's my next step? What would you all hope that Chicagoans get out of seeing this exhibit? And let me just ask real quick, a quick show of hands, how many of you all have seen the exhibit? And how many of you all plan to see it after the conversation? Okay. And so there's a lot of movement in the exhibit, and it is, I think, very significant to note that a science museum and anthropologists are the creators of this exhibit. So it starts with the science, moves. The picture I took, one of the quotes that I like was from the historian Robin Kelly. It was that race wasn't about categories, it was about hierarchies. And so then it moves to, you know, the transatlantic slave trade and how those hierarchies started and when race began to mean the way we think about it today. And then it moves to contemporary policies in the United States. And I won't give the rest away, so you have something to look forward to. But again, the question, what can Chicagoans do? What can they take out of this exhibit? Or what do you hope that they get out of it?
Well, partially what what at least I hope people take away from the exhibition is that some of the ways that we talk about race, that we talk about each other based on the way we look, we have to challenge those. And even in my own language, just from learning through this exhibition, I've had to kind of reorient some of the ways that I think about race. And when you bring up hierarchy, I think it's really critical. One of the big takeaways from the exhibition is that there are reasons that these categories exist. And typically they have to do with consolidation of power, consolidation of wealth, and maintaining hierarchies that either allow certain people to have the privilege of access to that wealth and that power, and certain people to be pushed away from it. And so I think that's something I hope that people take away with. And then apply that to questioning how is that working contemporarily here in the city that I live in. And so, this history, the science, the sociology of it all, I think that in some very simple ways, it provides some tools for analysis of our own lives here in Chicago.
Well, I want to follow up. You said that you've had to challenge yourself. So what language are you rethinking?
I'm rethinking actually race as a way of classifying people. I think these categories that are so cut and dry for us, race, is it white, is it black, is it, what is it? And thinking through how it's often a moving category depending on the time and context in which you live and your access or lack of access to power and privilege. So those are things that I'm thinking through in terms of the exhibition.
I think I would say that I come from academia a lot of my life, and sometimes the debates are like, oh, should we use race as the primary category, or should we use class as the primary category, or should we use gender as the primary category? So I do think it's really important the way that, sorry, my phone is buzzing. It's probably my 16-year-old asking if he can go to the mall or something. But anyway, but so the thing is that I really think that the way that we have to come out of this exhibit is that race, it's not an option, whether we think about it or not, right? It's not a sort of either or. It's so infused in everything that we do. And it is also infused with issues of class and gender and all these things also. So it's a false distinction to sort of create all of these silos and say that we have to choose. And of course, like in sort of jargon language, people talk about intersectionality, and that's how we should look at it. But that's just sort of an academic term for like when ain't I a woman? That canonical speech is also about intersectionality, thinking about all the different ways that and multiple identities that we all have. I think for me, the success of an exhibit is, and this one too, is not. We don't want it. I don't want it to reaffirm the things that I believe in, or sort of also sort of confirm these things, which is what social media usually does. I want, for me, when I left the exhibit, there is a little bit like I know what I'm against, but this question that we all need to ask ourselves as we create a new society is, what are we for, right? So if we don't want to see people in these ways, and we don't want to repeat history. That's great, but then what is the world in which we want to live in? And how do we want to actually understand the distinctions and differences amongst ourselves if it's not racially, And what do we get from changing and, sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater or whatever it may be? So I really feel like the power of an exhibition is to unleash our radical imaginations about the world that we want to create.
And the question, because I think sometimes the default for that is, well, let's be colorblind. And I hate that term.
Please.
Right? And that's not what we are striving for. In a utopia, does race matter? Should it matter? But it does matter. And so how to grapple with these things, like what are we? Like we want equity, we want fairness, we want redistribution of wealth. But like what is that? What are these things? What do we call them? And then how do we recognize cultural differences that should be celebrated? It's not like some people are like, oh, well, this country's going to be all mixed in 50 years and none of this will matter. But I'm like, I still want to hold on to my cultural things, whether that's food or music, and does it become this gumbo of everybody shares it?
That's a good question. And I feel like I want to revisit what I said, because when I say I'm questioning my notions of race, it doesn't mean that I know it exists, I believe it exists. It's impacted my life every step of the way. And it has, the history of race has created cultural affinities and created groups and cultural, as I said, cultural affinities. I think what I struggle with, or what I grapple with the most when dealing with some of the issues in that exhibition, is what does it look like? What does the world look like in a place where this category, this overarching idea doesn't exist? And I think when Lisa talks about radical imagination, I feel like that is the saddest part, or the saddest thing about these racial structures, these racial hierarchies that we live with, because our ability to envision something different is stifled in some ways. So I think beginning the conversation, or having projects like this, is a way to begin conversations about what does it mean to live beyond race, and not post-racial in a way that that acts as though race doesn't have an impact or an effect on people's lives. But what do we create that's something new and something different?
Yeah. I mean, I can say one quick thing, which is just, I sort of like these little maxims that I got from my son, which are sort of like, the poison is the cure, right? And that kind of thing. And in some ways, I feel like with race, it's the same. I think about that a lot, that maxim, because, race has been used to perpetrate some of the worst injustices, right? And what I want when we talk about the world that we're trying to create is, like, I want a just world. I don't want a world where we just celebrate difference, right? And we know from looking at history that sort of multiculturalism and the celebration of difference was actually introduced into our society at a time to stop the civil rights movement, to stop the gains of society that was sort of saying, like, sort of Martin Luther King saying, we have to actually look at militarism, we have to look at racism, and we have to look at sexism and sort of address those issues. And then all of a sudden we have a moment where we're like, hey, let's celebrate difference. And it's like not about celebrating difference, it's about how is it that we can think about racial difference in a way that we can also have a just world, right? And so I think that's, and economic justice, is part of that world. Environmental justice, how we actually live on this planet is part of that, and how we treat one another, so.
I want to shift the conversation to our lived experiences in Chicago. And I've told this story many times, but I'm going to take you back to 1991, summer, Chicago. I was going into my sophomore year of high school. My parents would be what you call probably free-range parents. I took the L places. My mom almost gave birth to my brother on the L. So it wasn't called the red line back then. So even in the neighborhood I grew up in, I wasn't limited, and Chicago can be very parochial. Like, we celebrate neighborhoods, but then we're also stifled by them. And so my friends and I had outgrown Evergreen Plaza by that age, for those Chicagoans in the room, and we would go downtown, go to Marshall Fields, go to North Michigan Avenue. And on the way back home, we were stopping off at home before we went to, you might have been at this concert, Joy, the Johnny Gill concert at the Regal Theater.
I saw Jodeci there. I didn't see
that. So at any rate, me and three of my best friends were on the train headed south, and I lived on 83rd in Michigan. So I was really going to get off at 79th or 87th Street. And you can see Chicago segregation by riding the CTA. And there was no South Loop back then. That was Skid Row. There was no Roosevelt stop. There was no Harrison stop. And so everybody white got off in the Loop. Maybe they went to Chinatown. And on this particular day, the train was full of white people, and we had passed downtown. And I was like, where are they going? Like, now, I knew that white people lived on the South Side. I went to school in Beverly. I saw white people, but they did not live off of 63rd Street in the Dan Ryan, 55th, any of those stops. And so I was like, oh, well, maybe this humongous group of white people is going to Chinatown. Well, we passed Chinatown, they're still on. And, you know, perhaps you could say this is a delicious reversal of privilege, because I'm like, why are they here? Like, where are they going? These are not my neighbors. And they all got off at 35th for Comiskey Park. And it's just like this light bulb went off for me. It was this moment where segregation became real to me. I grew up in Chatham. We did not have white people in our neighborhood. I didn't know the history behind that. But you know, I often say that segregation is like air and water for people in this region. We accept it as a reality. We don't interrogate it. We don't challenge it. We say things like people choose to live around people like them, not understanding that everyone's choice was helped by expressways the government built or loans that were given to you. But we treat it as this characteristic quirk rather than something that is far more deep-seated. So I want to hear from both of you. Lisa, you're from Poughkeepsie, New York. What brought you to Chicago?
Any Poughkeepsie in the house?
What brought you here, and where did you first live, and what were your impressions of this city with race?
Well, I came to Chicago basically to start an organization called the Public Square, which got eventually adopted by the Illinois Humanities. And I came up here because I was introduced by Stanley Fish, who was the dean at UIC at that time, to a group of really wonderful, radical professors at UIC, who he sort of said, oh, you have an idea, you should come and bring it here, because you can make stuff happen in Chicago. And at that time I was living in New York, and so I went to UIC and I met people.
And what year was this?
I think like 98, 99, something like that. And I met people like Barbara Ransby and Bill Ayers and other people who were doing really progressive work in the city of Chicago, and they sort of opened their arms to me and said, yeah, like, you should come here. The idea was to sort of create sort of public squares where institutions, sort of people could come together for dissent, discussion, and dialogue, and things like that. Because I had gone to graduate school at Duke, and I was a sort of assistant in a gender and women's studies conference that brought together scholars who were working on domestic violence, and also women who were living in domestic violence shelters at that time, and they had never actually talked to one another. And it was like this really rich, sort of conversation that developed in bringing people together across boundaries of difference. And so the idea was sort of, oh, we need more of those kinds of places. And so I really just sort of came here to sort of work on that project. And I didn't know where to live. I was then married to somebody whose family had grown up in Chicago, but where we ended up living was Glencoe, Illinois, which is not Chicago. And I remember, one of my first sort of events, because I was a poetry lover, I loved the arts, and so some of the first people I met, like Julie Parson Nesbitt, who was at the Guild Complex at that time, she sort of said, oh, you should come and go to this Young Chicago Authors event. And I remember going to this like incredibly diverse space with all different kinds of young people. And I was talking to one of the young people after the event, and I said, oh, I live in Glencoe, because they asked me. And they were like, oh my gosh, do you know this Gwendolyn Brooks poem, Lovers of the Poor? And I was like, no. And then when I got home, I read it, and it was about sort of rich white people taking the train in from the North Shore, pretending to try and help people of color in the city. And I was like, damn, I've just been totally, slammed by this young person. So, in any case, but then, of course, the histories of locations in our city are always so varied. Because of course, when you start to learn, it's like Glencoe has a very big Jewish population because also Jews were restricted from living in places like Kenilworth and Highland Park. And so there's all these like dense racial histories to a lot of places where we live. So even though if you live in a place where you think is completely homogeneous and all quote unquote white, and this is something the exhibit also talks about, you realize that whiteness itself is a category that is constantly fluctuating. And at that time, Jews were not seen as white, right? Mm-hmm. So anyway, so that's like another sort of story. But now I live in the city, but it's also not exactly the city because I live in River North, right? And, you know, in a sort of high rise that overlooks, you know, sort of what was the 70 acres of Cabrini Green, mm-hmm. you know, and so it's also a very divided sort of place that I live, and I sort of chose it because my kids, I got divorced, my kids go to school, you know, they divide time between their dad that lives, sorry, this is turning a little bit into like some sort of weird confessional. But anyway,
it's about neighborhood choice.
No, it is. But anyway, he still lives on the North Shore, and I needed to get on the highway, get on a train because they go to school up there. So that's sort of like whatever. But I'll sort of say that, I mean, there's not a moment in Chicago where sort of the issues of sort of race, choice, and segregation don't come alive. And I'll just want to share one other story which has always stayed with me. Because very early on, I mean, coming from New York, I was just like craving a soup dumpling and, you know, wanting Chinese food. So I went to, so going to Chinatown was one of the first places that I went. And I met, you know, an elderly Chinese woman who, you know, I grew up speaking Chinese, and that was sort of really, you know, my sort of jam. And I was talking to her, and she sort of looked at me and she asked me, oh, like, do you work downtown? And I sort of said, yeah, you know, I work, you know, down right across from Millennium Park. That's where the offices of Illinois Humanities was at that time. And she said, oh, someday I hope to go there, right? And she'd been living in Chicago for over 25 years. And she had just never gone to the so-called downtown of Chicago. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a story that we hear, I mean, that it's actually true for a lot of people. And so now, as someone who works in cultural institutions and thinking about museum campus or the so-called downtown, you know, you just really want to sort of acknowledge that the downtown for many people is not the downtown that we think, right? That there's many downtowns. So anyways, I'll stop.
Well, I don't know if you know this story or remember when we first met, it was through the public square. I moved back to Chicago in 2006 and was like researching like what organizations do I want to get on their mailing list, and Public Square was one of them. And this is when you lived on the Gold Coast, and Lisa had this event with the editor of The Nation in her home to strangers. Yeah. And I was like, wow, like this is, well, one, I wanted to go to meet the editor, but also I was like, I've never been to an apartment on the Gold Coast, so here's my chance. And I was just really struck at how you invited, like, you didn't, I mean, I'm sure you knew some people, but it was like I registered online and I came to your house.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's something about Chicago and the house party, right, which is really sort of quintessential. But like the sort of, I've always loved sort of spaces that blur the boundaries between so-called domestic space and public space. I feel like domesticity is another one of those categories that has oppressed people for many times, and then the lack of access to certain kind of public spheres has also really been oppressive for a lot of people. And so, you know, I've always sort of lived in places where I've been able to throw open my home and have sort of public events, and you know, and there's many places like that, I think, in Chicago, like all over the city, which have been spaces of like deep organizing. I mean, I mentioned Gwendolyn Brooks, but her house also was one of those kinds of places where poets and other, you know, like, and just young people would gather to like think and to plan and to organize and scheme. And those kind of places exist, you know, all throughout the city. Partially because some of our public institutions, or so-called public institutions, are so exclusive and not open to a lot of people. But that's another talk. Yeah.
Joy, you're a South Sider too?
I am, and so I was thinking about this in terms of experiences with race or consciousness of race, and as a child, I think, and of course I wouldn't have had the language at that time, but I was always very conscious of crossing streets and things changing quite rapidly. So I grew up in West Inglewood, which is kind of nestled between Inglewood proper, big Inglewood on the east, and Market Park, the Market Park neighborhood on the west. And I grew up in the 1980s off of Western Avenue and 71st Street. So if you all can kind of think of that, more southwest, Western orientation. And so my racial consciousness in the city really started when I started first grade, because we had to go west of Western into the Marquette Park neighborhood in 1982. So I walked to St. Adrian Grammar School with some neighbors from my block, and we walked, and we kind of grouped together and walked to school, and everything was cool. And I also went to the neighborhood was changing quite rapidly as I started school in the early 80s. So there was Eastern European young people and Latino young people and a handful of Black folks, and we were all kind of navigating this thing together. But I remember that every year St. Adrian Grammar School had their school ending picnic in Marquette Park. And in 1983, when I was 7, and that letter went home to my family, and my dad was like, well, I don't know about this, because my family moved into this house and on our street in 1975, second Black family. I have no recollection of there being any white people. By the time I was a 5-year-old child, everybody had left, well, there had been significant white flight. And so it was almost as if our neighborhood was changing block by block by block. And so I did go to Marquette Park, and as he suspected, I did get called a nigger by some kids, but I gave as good as I got, and and I understood. And that was my first kind of experience of that in that neighborhood. But it went on for the next 8 years. Every now and again there would be a flare up, and that's kind of when I just started to understand something different is happening here in Chicago. When I am oriented this way, there's a different community, and when I'm going this way, there's another community. And so navigating that and understanding the navigation and listening to where, particularly when you're on foot, in the car, on the bus, maybe not so much, but how your body inhabits certain spaces in the city of Chicago, and being very attuned to where you are is something that I learned early on, and that was kind of the beginning of my race consciousness here in this city. And it's something that I think I still carry with me in terms of informing the way I think about the city, and also just as I've learned more history, or as I grew older, just thinking, oh, so that's why that is like that. And this is why I think exhibitions like race are so important, or why history, the practice of history, particularly in formal learning, is so critical, because oftentimes we think of history as a big H, and it doesn't necessarily impact our lives. But when we can insert ourselves into these narratives, then I think our worlds open up. And hopefully through this exhibition, Chicago will open up for some young people so they understand where they fit and why they fit that particular way.
One thing that I think is unique, I mean, there are many things that are unique about the city when it comes to race and its history, but whiteness means something here. It's an identity. It's not just you're white. I remember when Rod Blagojevich got arrested, friends around the country was like, you all have a governor named Blagojevich? It's like, yeah, like, and we know how to say it and spell it. Like, that's not odd, but I remember that being odd to people. Or I hate that I'm gonna say the Kardashian name in a public space, but when people are like, they're not white, I'm like, what? That is just the most ridiculous. I mean, like, let's not even unpack how they are famous. It doesn't get more white than that. But, you know, I don't know any Armenians in Chicago who go around saying they're a person of color.
That's a good point.
That's all that needs to be said about race.
Well, I mean, like, you're Irish, you're Polish, like,
And
like,
I feel as though experientially, that's what I've known. I've known people, white people who are white when it's in opposition to blackness or in opposition to something else, but within my neighborhood, Southside Irish, or when I did go to grade school, Lithuanian, Polish, and very much identifying ethnically, except when it came to in opposition to blackness. So my 83 was a big year for me, right?
Harold Washington.
Harold Washington, and again, these dramas play out in grade school. You don't know what they mean, and oh my God, you know, all the black kids wanted Harold Washington to win. All the white kids wanted Epstein to win, and it was like war. And a young lady bet me $1 that Harold Washington would lose. I remember this. And she never paid me back. But these were the kinds of conversations that were going on in where I live, because there were still different kinds of affinities happening, I think.
But I think it's really important to see and call out how hard whiteness constantly needs to be working to be as invisible as it is, right? Also, because, and I always think about this exhibit at the Apartheid Museum in South Africa, where they sort of show in a 5-day period how many laws needed to be passed by the apartheid government to sort of insist and to create the apartheid system, right? It was like working on overdrive to sort of say, this kind of person can't live here, this kind of person can't marry this kind of person, da 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 da. Like this constant flow of energy and effort to create inequality. And it's really important because sometimes as an activist or someone who's trying to change things, you're like exhausted and you're like, oh my gosh, the status quo. But the status quo needs to constantly reproduce itself, you know? And so when you look at how hard sort of white privilege and whiteness actually needs to work to sort of pretend that it's not a category, that it is just sort of the way things are, but race is actually about blackness. It's about being Asian or Latino. Like, I mean, we need to unseed and uncover that, I think.
Yeah, I went to the Smithsonian African American History Museum in October, and the museum does this great job of showing the link between slavery and capitalism and all these laws that were passed. And so, you know, when I hear someone like Chief of Staff Kelly say there was no compromise, I mean, can't even get it out because it's so ludicrous, that there was, if there had been more compromise. And I'm like, the Missouri I mean, all those compromises are listed on the walls in the museum for people who apparently forgot that history. And it was working overtime here too. It might not have been categories in the same way, but this idea, like, what you do have to work at this hierarchy. It's not something that just blossomed on its own. And I would think it's the same thing here, like how we're not gonna let people live in this neighborhood. We're gonna create laws or real estate policies that say you can't have mobility and you have to stay. Like, all of this works over time.
Yeah, no. Today when I was just thinking about this conversation, there was an exhibit that Lisa Junkin at the Hull House Museum, when I was there, had worked on. It was about the conservative vice lords, a gang in Chicago. And one of the most poignant parts is the sort of exploration of Mayor Daley and his relationship to the Hamburg club, right?
Yeah.
Right, which
Not
was
the gang.
basically an Irish gang that called itself the Athletic Club that had a key role in the 1919 race riots in Chicago. Daley himself was a part of that, sort of inciting those riots. And at that critical moment when Daley came into power, how all of a sudden the sort of Hamburg Athletic Club actually became the Irish police force of Chicago, and they started to criminalize black gangs, right? And it's sort of like all of the sort of whiteness, which, you know, they needed to create a certain kind of what it meant to be white, the kind of, you know, sort of it meant to be the police, it meant to be whatever, you know, and the sort of access that needed to be created in order for whiteness to exist in the highest echelons of politics, et cetera. You know, it's sort of that preceded, in many ways, the sort of laws then that criminalize black folk, you know, and so I think that's
And then
important.
how Richard J. Daley became this role model in some ways. I mean, part of the lore around Larry Hoover, you know, if you were folks, it's like on The Boss. Boss is Larry Hoover. They say that he called himself the boss after Daley. Or Jeff Fort, Blackstone Rangers, had aspirations for politics because they saw you can be a gangster and be mayor.
Yeah.
And then give your friends jobs.
No, I was thinking when Lisa was talking about privilege as being the power to name and being the power to define what is criminal, what is not criminal, and how that is the seat of privilege, really. You know, and when you're talking about consolidation or whiteness and access and privilege, that in a lot of ways is where it lies. What can you create to maintain and keep that power going? And so I just was thinking very deeply about what you just mentioned.
Yeah, certainly in this age of what in some ways people have pointed out as the misnomer of mass incarceration, because it's not really mass incarceration, it's black incarceration, right? And so it's sort of that power to sort of define what is criminality is absolutely what is at play in our society, for sure.
Something happened in the news today, and I want us to briefly weigh in on it. You know, Chief Wahoo is no longer going to be on the field for the Cleveland team.
That's great. Yes.
And this morning on WBEZ, the morning shift, there was a call-in about, well, what about the, you know, Chief Illiniwek, and it was fascinating how many people called in, even though they're being told this is, you know, this is a fake dance, this was not real, this is appropriation. The call saying, well, I went to U of I and we were very respectful, and this is not like Chief Wahoo, and we're gonna keep celebrating it. And Lester Munson from ESPN kept saying, well, it's not true. This is, you know, this is the history around it. And it was just this, nope, this is part of my culture that I'm gonna continue to appropriate in the name of sports. And I thought about it tonight because there is, in the last room of the exhibition, there is a section about Native appropriation with mascots and sports. And it's right there. Don't do it. But it still becomes this convincing or trying to persuade people who just don't, because it doesn't, my sense was that it's taking a piece of their childhood. Or even this morning, the NPR story, which I thought was horrible, about Chief Wahoo. I know that's a bad thing to say, but it didn't quote any one Native. And they went to a bar and they quoted all these people saying, I'm not racist and I love Chief Wahoo and I'm gonna keep wearing my paraphernalia. Like, that was the reaction story.
again, I think it comes back to the privilege and power to name and claim what you will. And regardless of whether I say don't do that, you continue to do that, it shows the hubris and also the ownership that certain people feel they have over other people. It's a continuation of I want to say enslavement, but a continuation of the ability to, within this hierarchy, to say what you will, to do what you want without fear of repercussion, regardless of whether it's true or not. And I think that's something that we really have to come to terms with.
Yes. I also think that in addition to the naming, it's part of this much larger piece of us, like the reckoning that we need to go through around history and our symbols and the things that we have always held to be most dear, right? And I have this thing which, like it's my thing, which sometimes when I can't sleep, it sort of like just haunts me. And it's that as, somebody who's working for racial justice and also economic justice, a lot of times there's this, people talk about Samuel Gompers, and I drove past his monument that's off of Foster. And for those of you who don't know him, Samuel Gompers was the founder of the American Federation of Labor, a great hero who, who was a Chicagoan who led the AFL through all the beginning of the years, was its sort of head. He was also the author of a text which was called Meat versus Rice, and it was about sort of American maleness versus Asiatic cooliness. So he was one of the chief proponents of the Chinese Exclusion Act, was a terrible racist, was consistently sort of out there testifying in front of Congress about this sort of inferiority of Asian workers to American laborers, right? This is a hero of American labor. And that's sort of, that's the truth. And it's part of all of this sort of, I was just in New Orleans and I sort of saw the giant plinth that General Lee used to stand on. Who are our heroes that we are sort of valuing and we attach so much meaning to? And like, what is the sort of histories of these people? And it's our inability to address these racist histories which compel us to feel like the sort of comfort that these symbols have still, is more important than confronting the truth of history. I mean, what we do about that sort of history, like if, it's sort of, I think the confrontation needs to happen first, and then some process of restorative justice of what does it mean. If you're unwilling to confront the fact that there was a mass genocide in our country, where we actually, sort of destroyed a whole beautiful culture of indigenous folk, you're not going to be able to give up your mascot. So it's sort of like one has to come first, and so we can't sort of say, oh wait, can't you see how important, how important this mascot is, blah, blah, blah. It's about this, and that's actually what we need to be talking about.
Before we turn this over to the audience, I want the two of you to think about radical imagination and what Chicago could look like going forward. And I'm not asking you to take down white supremacy or like structural racism in one fell swoop, but so Lisa, I don't know if you know this, but I go around quoting you all the time. So in my book, I have the end of the South Side, in which I quote scholars and activists and policymakers about what Chicago can do. And Lisa says that we have to stop thinking about food, arts, and culture as the extras of a city. And these are the things that actually make up the city, make up neighborhoods, and looking beyond the institutions that have endowments and that are going to be fine, like the Art Institute, probably like even the institute that we're sitting in right now. And house music being this amazing cultural export that most Chicagoans who aren't Black don't even really know about. And when people ask me, what can they do in their lives, I often say, look at the segregation in your own lives. And No, this isn't like sitting in boring zoning meetings about exclusionary, changing that structure, but people have to start looking within themselves first. And, Chicago's vastness is an asset and a weakness. And it means that we don't explore because there's no reason for you to visit Pullman if you live in Portage Park, perhaps. But we have these amazing neighborhoods that have these assets in them. So that might have been your answer, Arts, but what are some everyday things that people can do, or what is your radical vision for a more just Chicago?
Ooh, I mean, I would definitely say the arts and culture, but one of the reasons I say that is because I sort of learned as a student when I was the director of the Jane Addams Hull House Museum. And I always tell this very short story. I think it's so important. So when Jane Addams first moved to the West Side, and there were, sort of 22 different ethnic, sort of groups, quote unquote, that were living there, one of the first things she did was throw open her home and invited Italian neighbors to come to her home to make dinner. And they sort of said, well, let us make dinner for you. And there's a beautiful letter that she writes home that sort of says, oh my gosh, I just had this really weird thing, which is meat that is boiled for a really long time in tomato sauce, and then they pour it over macaroni, And she's like, this blew her mind. It was her first taste of like spaghetti bolognese or whatever, right? And she writes about this experience later on in 20 Years at Hull House and talks about how this literal sort of willingness to open up her body and her sort of mind to a different kind of taste, to change her taste about what she thought was good, what she thought was beautiful, what she thought was just. That actually was what the Hull House was also about. And so she had this idea that, one, what all great, I think, justice activists have, Grace Lee Boggs used to say it also, that like revolution begins with individual evolution, right? That the sense that we need to be open to transforming that which we hold most dear, that what we think is beautiful, like perhaps we actually don't know, that it's been sort of constructed by our environment, how we were brought up or whatever, and to open ourselves to other forms of art, for other ways of seeing the world. And it also is, our taste buds, literally, right? Sort of like what we eat and how we sort of, how we move in the world, like through dance or other ways. Like all of these ways of being are both, so much part of us, but they're also that which entrap us. And so the sort of self-evolution is so much part of the revolution that has to happen. It's hard to say that without sounding like so self-helpy and like goofy, but that's why I like to quote, Grace Lee Boggs and other great activists, Ella Baker, they all sort of said versions of this, which is, that you can't sort of think that you know what's right and go out and sort of offer it as a service to other people. It has to be about a constant self-transformation and evolution. And the arts and culture, I feel like, is one of the best ways of doing it. Because I think, it's absolutely important to legislate certain things that need to be changed, and you need to have the laws, and you need to have sort of the ways of enforcing the laws in order to create a just society. But nothing is going to change unless we culturally and socially work with one another to create a more just world, which is not necessarily just through legislation.
So I have two things. One is very simple that I think would help create a different world, and that is for us to be curious about each other, curious enough about each other to engage each other beyond the niceties of hello, how are you doing, I'm fine, and then moving on. Curious about each other's lives, curious about how other people live, how we live. And I think that if we start there, that and getting to know our neighbors, I think that's something that's critical here in Chicago. And not just the folks that live next door to us, but the people who do live across Western or across 71st Street. I think we don't engage enough with each other. And then the second thing is something that's always stifled me or confused me since I was a young woman. And that is, as a collective, when will we decide that all of our children deserve a quality education?
Yeah.
And it's barbaric to think through some of and think about the ways in the past young people have had to fight for their education and their parents have had to fight for their educations, and the way that it continues now. One of the things that attracts me to this work is because I feel like as a collective, we're looking for resolution. We have so many loose ends, so many things that we've left undone. And that is, if we can't do that for our children, then I'm not really sure what we can do. So there's one small thing and then one kind of big thing, I think. Kind of very big.
Yeah.
So,
Right, yeah. But I like the big things. I mean, I want to
things.
say also, I know you want to open it up, but I do have to say I'd be remiss if I didn't actually talk just for 2 seconds about the National Public Housing
I
Museum.
meant to, I didn't even get a
Which
chance
is,
to
I know,
ask
and also
you,
you've
but
been
it
doing
was-
such glorious reporting about everything that's been happening around the Plan for Transformation, so thank you, Natalie Moore, for all of that work. But, I mean, I would say that, I think being ambitious is also really important, right? So it's like the small things that we do, but like, I remember I was talking to Bernadine Dorn the other day, and I said, like, what's happening, what are you working on for 2018? She's like, oh, I'm gonna close down the Cook County, jail. Right? Like, and that is what's going to happen, right? And so there's a part where I'm working on a project now, which is to open the National Public Housing Museum, which is also in that way the ambitious project of really not just preserving and interpreting, but propelling housing as a human right. And sort of some of these basic things like air and water, culture, music, they also include things like housing and education. And it's sort of like, I think the creation of different kinds of cultural institutions, which are not just for the so-called 99%, of the world, but cultural institutions that really belong to the people, are made by the people and for the people, are also like what's on the agenda for 2018. So anyways, that's last thing.
So we have a mic runner right here, so raise your hand and he will come to you.
Over here.
Hi. This is awkward. So first of all, thank you guys for sharing your thoughts, and Joy for organizing the exhibition upstairs. So towards the end of your comments, you mentioned education. I'd like to follow up on that. So on school choice and desegregation, I've heard people saying that school choice can desegregate our schools, and I've heard people saying that it will do the exact opposite, both district school choice and charter school choice. So where do you guys fall on school choice and desegregation? And also, have you seen any best practices or worst practices in that arena?
Well, I'll just say, this isn't taking a position on school choice, but it's white people don't go to charter schools in Chicago. They just, I think the figures are CPS is 9% white, and their attendance in charter school is around 1%. So, people can say, well, charter school, so I'm not making a judgment on charter schools, just except to give the facts that this is where Black and Latino parents send their children, and they tend to be in those neighborhoods as well.
I can just quickly say that just as a sort of historian looking back throughout time, the notion of choice has never been good way of creating a democracy or any social movement, because choice is always so limited to who gets to choose and the sort of huge spectrum. And I mean, I also say this as somebody who is a feminist who is pro-choice, quote unquote, and understanding that it's actually also a really bad term of way of thinking about reproductive justice, right? So there's a lot of different sort of movements that have sort of realized that, oh wait, choice is so much about individualism, it's about sort of, you know, this fake sort of distinction about like this or that, when, you know, the sort of options have always been limited to us. So, I mean, I don't feel like the sort of realm of choice as sort of the way where how we can create the most free society, you know, so that's one thing. I mean, I'm totally opposed to charter schools, so I'll just come out there and say that. But, you know, I really believe that one of the solutions that we have to all work towards is to reinvigorate the notion of the public and sort of the commons. And so for me, the sort of charter school option just, you know, sort of comes in there and doesn't do that. The sort of privatization of so many of the spheres of our lives, which are the foundations of what we need to build a society, like can't be in any way, shape, or form privatized. And I really, truly believe that.
I agree with that. I also think that when we're talking about desegregation, I think this is where this exhibition becomes really important to me. If you live in a segregated city and you go to a segregated school in your neighborhood, again, when we start to envision the future, what does that actually look like? We've tried busing, you know, there are all these things that historically we've tried to do without really addressing systematic segregation or systemic segregation and racism in the city. So the choice issue, I would agree with Lisa. And I think we do need to, and I say that having gone to private schools my whole life, because that was the choice that my parents felt. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay, sorry. Felt that they had to make. So I don't know if I can answer that with any authority. But I do think that my ultimate statement was really about, as a collective, we have to think through what kind of future we want for young people, and what does that mean when we're building education systems that are basically preparing them not for jobs, not for a future, but for jailhouses. And I think that we need to, it just really, it affects me deeply, and I don't know what the answer is.
One thing I would say too, just quickly, is I was reading, I mean, the other person in this country who's also doing great reporting in addition to Natalie is Nicole Hannah-Jones, and she has, you know, this, on one of her pieces, she asked the question, you know, could we live in a society where a school is 90% black and 10% white, but it's still celebrated as an amazing, great school, right? So it's not like the issue isn't, oh, I want to send my kids to a diverse school, so it's like 30-30-30, like a mixed income version of, you know, but you want excellent education. And so like that kind of school may not be desegregated, but it could be excellent, right? And the thing is, in this moment of time, we can't even imagine that there would be a school that would be in that sort of way, and so that's one of the issues.
Well, I mean, there are white parents don't pick that.
Don't want their kids.
So
yeah.
I mean, as I navigate the public school system, there's probably going to be more slots at McDade if I go selective enrollment. McDade, Leonard, Poe, top schools in the city, no white students. So when parents say, I want a great education for my kid, no, they still want it to be white because they're not going to come south to the top schools in the city.
Yeah.
Right here.
Hi, I have a question. It's something that I've grappled with for a long time. When I was young, I was still in college doing my student teaching, a privileged white woman teaching at a privileged white school and teaching Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. I had a skinhead in my class who wrote a paper basically saying that Martin Luther King was a womanizer. And I posed the question, I was very young at the time, posed the question to my class, did it matter if he was or not, and if what he was saying was truly amazing? And the thing that struck me then and still strikes me now, and I've never really been able to come to terms with, is that those students all said, yes, it mattered. And then fast forward to today, I am very active in League of Women Voters, and our founder was a racist. And so this is something that we are definitely, as a league, we're distancing ourselves from. She did great, amazing work for women and women's suffrage, but she was a racist. So I don't know exactly what question I'm asking, but I'm not sure how do we come to terms with, for instance, for myself, like how do I come to terms with someone who I think has done some really great things but was really racist?
Well, you just talked about Samuel
Gompers, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think how we come to terms with them is that we realize that they aren't saints or just sinners, but they're human beings, right? And one, I have a dream speech, maybe it's just not the good speech to teach because there are a lot of better speeches. But besides that, you know, we're not asking them to lionize Martin Luther King and to say that he was perfect. I think it absolutely matters that he was a womanizer, and we should be talking about the issues around that, right? But that doesn't mean that you sort of throw that person away, right? I mean, all of us are human beings. Are you okay? Water? Okay. All of us are sort of people living within the moment with all of our imperfections and our particular blinders on. And I think the problem is when we want to actually sort of put it underneath the couch, right? So and sort of say, like at one time people were like, you know, Jane Addams actually had some scary racist, you know, ideas and got into a big fight with Ida B. Wells Barnett, which, you know, what should we do with that history? And like you tell it, right? You sort of grapple with it and you sort of say, yes, that was the case. That doesn't sort of change the sort of other facts, right? And that's why I'm trying to figure out, like, I feel like I want to celebrate the work that Gompers did around labor and to also say, yeah, and he was also a terrible racist, and what that means is we need to look at the labor movements that are now and how they're constructed, and how do we address the racism and sexism in labor movements that still exist, right? So I think it's about not choosing either like 100% great, 100% evil, you know, but you know, really addressing it and not pretending it didn't exist.
I think we have time for one more short, brief question or comment. There's someone down front, right here.
Hi, thank you for the talk tonight. And I wanted to say, I already spent 2 hours in the exhibit, and I feel like I want to just do that again. I feel like I lived through many things that were touched on in the exhibit. I remember eugenics was still being taught even when I was in college. I mean, it's just a powerful thing, and we've heard this a million times. You have to know your history, not to repeat your history. And I just really love the exhibit. And I like at the end when they were talking about the census and the choices of rewording the choices that could be on a census form to fill out. And I just wondered if what you thought about really changing the wordage. We were talking about that a little bit before.
Do you have anything to say about the census?
I mean, I think that those questions matter because they directly affect our neighborhoods and our cities and the way they're constructed. That means money and resources. You know, the part of the exhibit talks about all the different words. You know, uses the example, avocado is a fruit in some countries, it's a vegetable in others, but it's the same thing. And in how Brazil, there are so many racial categories. I mean, the one thing that I like about the United States is that blackness is a big tent. To be Black American means that you are mixed with something, you know, even if it's not your direct parent. And so I don't particularly like, I don't think I would particularly like, and maybe this is based on my own racial construction of, you know, having 2 Black parents, but also understanding that what does it mean to be Black American? To me, it means something bigger, because obviously it's not about complexion, because we're not all of us are physically Black. And sometimes I feel like there's a little bit of anti-Blackness that comes in there, especially when I hear people who have mixed heritage like claim everything else but the Blackness. It's like, well, I'm all of this, I'm all of that. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't celebrate your heritage, but I feel like there's an anti-Blackness slant sometimes to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how that information is utilized, right? Because right now there's a movement, for example, in Illinois and all across the country to like ban the box, right? So a lot of college applications, they ask if you were formerly incarcerated. Now, and you want to ban that box because you know that they're using that information to actually discriminate against people. If they were asking because actually everyone who's formerly incarcerated gets a free scholarship, I would be like, keep it on there, right? And so there is a little bit of like, how is that classification in the census actually, how is it being utilized? How does it reinforce certain sort of ideas of who we are? And so for me, I think it's unclear. I mean, you can see the history and the evolution of the different categories that existed that is more sort of a reflection of our sort of changing identities and sort of understandings of race, which is more of like our limitations, right? It's sort of, the box right now is more about our inabilities to sort of imagine, I think, sort of different kinds of beings and sort of limiting people in their choices. But I think a really important thing is to sort of ask, you know, how is that information being utilized in sort of politics, in sort of voting, and other ways that we may not even nefariously actually know about, you know? And then if it's being used for sort of positive justice purposes, then I think it's okay to keep those kinds of questions. And if not, then I would just get rid of them.
We're going to keep this conversation going out in the lobby. Well, where exactly? The cafe area where there's food and a cash bar. But thank you. Hopefully Joy is feeling better. Thank you so much.